Hello everybody. I have horribly neglected my military history Q&As, so I'm going to try to go through some of them now. I'm still in the middle of an enormous editing process to bring you all the documentaries of what I filmed out in Europe over the past month. But let's get right into it. I feel bad, and let's see if we can knock out some questions here. So Kirill, he asks, were the German servicemen during World War II taller than the Americans? Where actually, no, they were not. At that time, the Americans, due to the high standard of living, relatively high standard of living, were amongst the tallest soldiers in the world, with an about average height of 5.8.5 inches tall, whereas the German soldiers were about 5.7. So the German soldiers were just a little bit shorter during World War II than the average Americans. However, if we have the illusion of all these tall Aryan super soldiers in German armies, because most people, they talk about the SS, where you have to be over 6 feet tall, and obviously you get the pick of the cream of the crop going for the Waffen-SS especially. Also, you have to think about the German soldiers who fought World War II. Many of them were born or young kids during World War I, where there was widespread starvation and lack of food, and it was generally a miserable experience to grow up around that time and the post-World War I era, which poor nutrition would also stunt some of their growth. And hey, that's about it. And just in case you really want to know, the average height of the Japanese servicemen during World War II was 5'4". Next, Thomas is asking me what happened to kamikaze pilots who failed or wimped out. Now, in my Q&A before I left for Europe, I did a whole long bit on kamikaze pilots during World War II in general, so I would refer to that, but I'll give you the quick answer. Japanese kamikaze pilots did sometimes fail because they failed to locate an enemy ship. Say, we're talking about the pilots especially. You couldn't find a ship to crash into, so they would come back. And if you do that once, it happens. Twice, it would happen with a raised eyebrow. And some, if you kept doing it and kept coming back, some were actually court-martialed and shot. I believe that was after 8 returns. There was also sometimes they would fly in 2s, 3s, or 4s. So for the peer pressure, none of them would wimp out, to use the term here. Of course, if you were in one of the miniature kamikaze submarines, the Kai-10s, there were no coming back. If you got screwed into the cockpit of a Kai-10 and you got launched, you were not coming back. There's a suicide button, or you hit a ship, or you failed, or you drowned, or you died. But the pilots sometimes would return. There are quite a few notable stories of kamikaze pilots that survived the war after having done 1 or 2, 3 mechanical failures were very often an issue for why they returned. But I defer back to the video I did, where I did almost an hour on that specific topic. So John is asking a hypothetical question. Who would win a battle? 50 US soldiers from 2020 or 100 German soldiers from 1914? Well, yeah, when you ask the question that way, obviously it would be so easy to just say, well, obviously, if you have 50 modern, well-trained, professional combat soldiers with automatic, semi-automatic weapons, with radios, with grenade launchers, all the tactical innovations and the learning of history for those 100 years in between, versus 100 German soldiers with hand signals and conscript soldiers to boot, and bolt action rifles on a field, well, that's a fairly easy fight. However, you didn't give me any specifics. Are we talking about everybody from the 2020 soldiers armed with modern weapons versus the old weapons? Or are we putting them on an equal footing where the 50 versus the 100 with the same equipment get to battle it out? Do they get to battle it out in 2020 with new equipment or old equipment? Do they get to battle it out in 1914 with old equipment or new equipment? There's way too many questions I would have to ask you to give you an exact answer. So I'm just going to take my own take on this and give you an answer I think might be interesting. Now, I am still affiliated with the military. And one of the things I do as a staff sergeant is I'm involved in training. My very first service was in a Danish Guard military police unit for a couple of years before I joined the Queen's Royal Life Regiment. Our training was fairly tough and good. I was extremely tired, wet, and proud when I got my Queen's Royal Life Regiment insignia because it was a tiring experience. Later on, I was involved in training U.S. Army soldiers up close to the 2000s. And now, some years past that in 2020, I'm still involved in training of U.S. military personnel. Now, I will tell you one thing that is a constant worry and concern for me now is I keep hearing the term, we can't do this because of liability. Oh no, what if somebody gets hurt? As a matter of fact, we did our PT training yesterday to certify to get shipped out and fight fires. Except we couldn't do the running part because there was smoke in the air. We are certifying to go put out fires. Now, where I'm going with this is, over the past 40 years, we have gradually started babying our soldiers, and we are training less and less hard, and there's more and more breaks. Boot camp now is not the same as boot camp 20 years ago, definitely not the same as it was 40 years ago, and I'm pretty damn sure the U.S. Army, although we great training and technology, we're spending a lot of time in front of computers, writing things. We do probably not do the hardcore in the field, wet, cold, hard, being beaten with sticks, as German recruits were in 1914. How many soldiers do you know that came out of boot camp yesterday who's going to sit uncomplaining to their military union for having been stuck in a trench for 2, 3, 4 years under heavy shelling, sometimes stuck in a 2 or 3 feet of water, as it were for all World War I soldiers? What I'm saying is World War I soldiers were pretty damn tough and pretty damn resilient. And I'm not saying that we don't have tough soldiers today, but I'm saying under the same circumstances, I'm not sure what 50 soldiers I would take with me today and dump in a World War I battlefield and not expect a lot of complaining. So maybe the Germans in 2014 would have an advantage on their own battlefield because they came out of being used to having a lot less. They got by with less equipment, with less food. There were no creature comforts, and there was definitely no Taco Bell back on their base. They had heavy artillery, they had mortars, planes started to spot for them, and they had decent equipment. So they did know how their job of soldering was to be done. I don't know why I said that with some weird accent, but the job of soldiering, you cannot take away from any soldiers for 2014 or World War I soldiers because they knew how to be soldiers. They may not know the tactics and all the technology that we know today, but they damn well know how to fight under horrible adverse conditions. So it depends. Are these battle-hardened World War I soldiers, or are they new recruits coming right out of a U.S. military boot camp today. A lot of questions, just food for thought. What I'm trying to say with that is we should probably train a little harder and a little tougher, and I really don't want to hear the word liability every time we train to go to war. I think that was my own personal gripe on that one. However, what I'm trying to say there is I need a lot more information and specifics how you want to set up the battlefield before I can tell you who can win. Because given the circumstances and the time and the place and the battle, that victory goes to either side for the reasons I just mentioned. So I hope you're satisfied with that one. If not, send me a little bit more specific question. And please don't write me about how tough and cool you are from your recent boot camp, because I know I am generalizing, and those old school soldiers out there, you all know what I mean. Alright, so Martin asks me, after World War II, the US brought some of the top Nazi scientists back to help us with our space program. Why were the Nazi scientists so much better at building rockets? Well, for a number of reasons. The German government have been funding them for over 10 years, and they have been working very diligently with building rockets for a different purpose than the Allied or the US did. But we really didn't need a standoff distance weapon such as a rocket, because we had thousands of bombers filling the skies over Germany, so we just bombed them and dropped a bunch of dumb bombs. The Germans desperately needed a weapon to strike back from a distance, and they needed the rockets. They needed rockets to shoot down airplanes. They needed rockets to hit back at Allied beachheads or at Allied cities to at least tell their population they're doing something to counter the fact that they're being bombed into rubble every day and night by British and American air forces. So basically, very simply put, the scientists in Germany had worked longer and more on specifics with rockets. They had more experience with ballistic missiles. They had the V1, the V2. They already had the V3 on the drawing board. They had perfected the Nebelwerfer to a degree that I will go into a lot more detail on a future video specifically on that for you, because I just came back from Peenemünde and I learned some very interesting things that I will share with you. But when I saw what von Braun and his fellow scientists' weapons projects actually were that involved rocketry, there was a nice, really good guy out there. He had a museum where he had some of all of von Braun's projects, not just the V1, V2. He was working very hard on a ground-to-air missile, and, well, quite a few of them actually. And when you look at the fact that the Germans, they already had camera, remote-operated, guided bombs, missiles, they were quite a bit more advanced when it came to rocketry, because they simply had more need, and they had the need for speed. Yeah, I know. And if you can tell me what film that was from, I'll send you a cheese. The Need for Speed. You damn well better have seen that movie. Anyway, they just had more experience, and they worked hard on it from a different perspective. I remember in one of the videos I did for you guys, we worked on one of the American rockets that was still just a drop and point missile that barely saw service in World War II, not until Korea, whereas the Germans were actively working on remote guided, camera guided missiles and rockets. And if you look at the test stands, as I will show you pictures of in my special that's coming up when I'm done editing it, I know, I only have so many hours in the day. I was surprised to see that the rocket ramps, factory halls built at Peenemünde, they were not built with the V2 in mind. They were built with the V3 or 4 in mind, because they already had them upscaled for the next generation rockets. So they had made plans for If had they won the war, had it lasted longer, for a lot larger missiles that also would have reached America. However, they did actually have something that could have done that, and might have done that. But you got to wait for my special on that one. But quite frankly, that's the simple answer. They worked on it for a lot longer. They were better funded when it came to it, and there's a greater need for Nazi Germany to have rockets, ballistic missiles, ground-to-air missiles than for the United States. So there you go. All right, Pardeep asks, what happened to the Sudeten Germans at the end of the Second World War? Did they go back to Czechoslovakia? No. Well, rephrase. Some of them did, and then they were kicked out. Actually, the Sudeten Germans, Sudetenland was one of the parts of previous pre-World War I Germany that was seceded after World War I to Czechoslovakia, and consisting predominantly of ethnic Germans. And leading up to 1938, when Sudetenland was annexed by Adolf Hitler, there was a lot of conflict and strife. Some of it was constructed and some was genuine between the Sudetens and the Czechs. And of course, the Sudeten Germans were quite happy to see German troops march in and make Sudetenland German again, because they were all considering themselves Germans. So after the war, before Czechoslovakia even became a Russian puppet state, as it did, the Sudeten Germans, the ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, were expelled and kicked out, and very often, very violently, very brutally. A lot of them were killed, and it was a very not pretty time of history. They were, all of them were literally hunted and chased out of the villages, even if they lived there for hundreds of years. And even worse was when Sudeten German Jewish former concentration camp inmates that had been released at the end of the war had come back to their pre-war home. They too were told they were no longer welcome. So yeah, they fled. A lot of them fled before the Russians came, but not nearly enough. There were a lot of atrocities committed against them. And I don't have to go into details when I say that, when we talk about women and children and people fleeing, along with German soldiers that are also fleeing. The same thing. Yeah, I don't have to go into details about it, and you know exactly what happens at the end of a war, or when one side wins over another and the women are caught in the middle. So yeah, no, none of them stayed, and a lot of them ended up in temporary camps in Germany. Some of them made up to Denmark. If they could immigrate out of Europe, some of them, if they had the opportunity to go to England, to go to America, some did, but they did not stay in what was Sudetenland before the war. I hope that pretty much clears that up for you. There's not a lot to say. The numbers of how many there were is so conflicting, I'm not going to give you any. I'm just saying whichever number there were before the war were no longer there some 6, 7, 8 months after. Because during the wartime, no one really knew who had left during the time of the war, who had been killed, and so on and so forth. So the numbers are just, there's no uniform number, except they all were gone. I gotta do one more, and then I'll go back to editing everything I promised to give you. I just wanted to do some of your questions so you don't feel neglected. Brian is asking, did Lend-Lease Act make the U.S. an unofficial participant in the war against Germany? Let me see. How can I put this? Yes. And this is where emotions come in and go like, well, they had to because Hitler was bad and Nazi Germany and so on and so forth. But yes, it absolutely did, because the U.S. did a deal with Britain that was solely in the favor of Britain, not as a neutral country willing to sell weapons to all other countries that asked. Germany was not allowed to buy weapons from the United States. So the United States actually, in actual terms, delivered weapons, munitions, ships, whatever Britain needed and whatever Russia needed to them, to be paid back later. So technically they did it free at cost. So America rearmed and supplied England and Russia in the initial years of World War II. And not only that, their navies also shot at German submarines and embargoes and other things that were not really directly related to the Lend-Lease. But the German admirals and Oerida had begged Hitler to declare war on America so he could finally shoot back at the American warships that kept hunting his submarines. So America did more at the time of Lend-Lease than just give material aid to Germany's enemy, thus taking sides. And if you side with my enemy, you become my enemy. I think that's pretty straightforward. If you supply arms to one side, but not to the other, well, you are siding with that side. No matter how you twist and turn it, no matter how much you hated Nazi Germany and whatever bad things they did, America still took a side to supply Britain and Russia and sided against Germany. And I will say that most certainly made them I'm not even going to say it was an unofficial participant. I will say that made them an official participant in the war against Germany, just not actively. And it really is that simple. You can then decide, you can start determining and have conversations about the cause. Well, why did we help Britain against Germany? Well, because Germany did a whole bunch of bad things. Okay. Well, we can also break that down. So, well, why did we then help Russia? Because it's not like they didn't do a whole lot of bad things for pretty much, I don't know, ever since there's certainly the Russian Revolution. So there's more facets to this, but yes, that would be the simple answer, yes. And the numbers of the Lend-Lease vehicles that I will put up for you, it was a significant amount of material aid to both England and Russia during the war. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea for Hitler to then officially declare war, well, practically America was already waging a war against Germany, but Germany and Germany's navy and submarines had strict orders to not shoot at American ships, warships, shipping anything. So they couldn't really defend themselves while trying to sink the British convoys against whom they were in active war with. War became inevitable years before that. Whether it was declared or not, it was still a fact. It was just a matter of, I guess, the paperwork, and I guess Hitler handed it in before Roosevelt did. But it was, World War II was inevitable ever since World War I ended. But that is a whole different story that I actually did cover in, I think, my very first military history Q&A. And yes, I had to give you a couple of pictures of the week. This is what appears to be a World War I German colonial soldier. I am really interested if anybody knows any more about how many Africans fought in German uniform during World War I. It's not a story that's often talked about, so what do you know? This one, I just don't know. It's not where I seem to remember torpedoes being loaded into submarines, so I thought it was an interesting photo I wanted to share with all of you. Maybe some of you know the stories to this one. Anyway, pictures of the week. Right, I'm going to go back to editing from the actual sites and the documentaries that I filmed. I just wanted to answer some of the questions quickly or briefly, with a few photos for you guys, just so you don't feel neglected. Keep sending your questions, militaryhistoryqa@mail.com, lostbattlefields.com. I will try to do everything at the same time, and if you have a assistant, send them.